All right, guys, what's going on? So today I'm chatting with Mike Tuchscherer, and we're going to be talking about his process for individualizing training. So first off, I want to say thanks, Mike, for jumping on the podcast again. This will be his second time appearing. His first one got a ton of great responses and continue actually to get messages about it. So I'm really excited to have you back on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we actually, you can maybe give like a little bit of an introduction. If any of you guys don't know who he is, you should probably just stop following me. But for those who don't, maybe just tell a little bit about yourself.
I guess my claims to fame are founding reactive training systems. I'm the guy I can take credit for popularizing RPE for barbell sports and the RPE scale, like correlated to reps in reserve, at least on the high end. Um, that was something that I to my knowledge, invented um, back in, like the 2005, 2006 timeframe. And, I was a good lifter at the time and competitive, so it helped it gain some traction. And, I like to think it's a useful tool as well, but, more recently I've been focused more on organization of training, individualization of training, which individualization in particular is a thread that's run through my whole career. Like if you consider like some of my early work and what I was talking about then with RPE and things like that, really the benefits of things like that are to individualization. It helps you tailor the training plan to fit the lifter. And I would say that I've continued to build on that idea, and gone more in the, I guess more recently, spent a lot of time thinking about how to best organize training, which has kind of led to emerging strategies and all the things that we talk about there. So I suppose that's the high level summary of what I've been up to the last decade.
Awesome. So, what are some of those key variables that you actually look to when you're attempting to individualize a program for an athlete?
I don't take too much off the table, to be honest. I mean, I would say the only thing that's, non-negotiable. I mean, I would hate to even put a label on that, but on some level is pretty close to non-negotiable. Is we've got to train the competition movements at some point. Um, Usually that's fairly frequently. I would say that I've got a somewhat of a frequency bias, at least compared to like old school powerlifting. Like if you look at what powerlifters thought about frequency before, say, 2015, 2012, somewhere in there, it was more in the realm of, you train the competition lifts like once a week and then, do a lot of assistance. And I would say that while most of my programs aren't terribly far off of that, uh, the selections that I have for assistance, developmental exercises, preparatory exercises, things like that, tend to be higher specificity movements. So while I will write a program that trains the specific competition exercise multiple times a week, my preference is more to have the competition lift itself in there once a week, and then we're doing specialized movement drills and things like that. That's absolutely not a non-negotiable. I'm not even sure that I would advise that. That's just a tendency that I've noticed in my own training, and the training that I write. So a lot of what I've learned is kind of observing what coaches, including myself, do in the real world, and then kind of extrapolating from there.
And so, On a little bit more of like a granular level, I guess, what are some of those things that you are kind of paying attention to that maybe you're observing other coaches have done, and then just through your experience you found to be effective? So, for instance, um, I know some people like to set sort of volume targets and then progressively, head in that direction. Other people like to um, maybe work up to certain RPE targets, or like, keep everything fixed and then just try and increase load while maintaining a certain RPE. What are some of those things that you found to be relatively effective, and strategies you've implemented, just kind of broadly speaking?
Sure. I guess maybe I should start with kind of the broad strokes framework of what emerging strategies is. And I hope this doesn't get boring for the people that have heard it before, but I think it's important to kind of a common ground for moving forward. So, in a typical emerging strategies program, we're going to write one microcycle of training. So, think of it like one training week, and that's on repeat. So same exercises, same reps, same RPE, same sets. The weight on the bar will fluctuate a little bit based on the athlete's performance, but the idea is to deliver the same stimulus every microcycle, every week. You know, um, and we can kind of talk about some exceptions to that later, but I think that's a good place to start. So if you're, say, squatting competition exercise sets of 5, you would squat sets of 5, the same number of sets, the same number of reps, the same RPE, at least attempting the same RPE every week for as long as your performance is improving. And you track that and you customize the length of the development block so that it matches the athlete's performance adaptation. So if an athlete tends to get better in a training block for 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 8 weeks, you match the athlete's response. And you'll see that that's kind of a theme through the whole thing. So what that does is it helps reduce the noise so we can see the signal more clearly. So if at the end of that development block, we look back on it and say, hey, that was a really good block compared to all the other blocks you've done, maybe that tells us something about your response to those sets of 5, or maybe it was the hack squats that we did as a preparatory exercise or something else. Now one block doesn't tell you a whole lot by itself, but as you start doing subsequent blocks, a picture starts to emerge, and you start to see, hey, every time I have a development block that's between 4 and 6 reps at an 8 RPE, I seem to get better. Blocks that contain single leg movements tend to perform better than blocks that don't contain single leg movements. You'll start to notice things like that. And I like to use those observations as a basis for that individualization. So to answer your question more specifically, when you ask, like, what kinds of things might we individualize? Again, I like to try not to take anything off the table. So it could be the frequency that we're training at. Maybe somebody, needs to train a muscle group or a movement pattern or a microcycle frequency, at different rates. It may be a set of exercises, maybe intensity or volume. We can look at these things and kind of get an idea of what the athlete is going to respond best to. And then, we do use both our coaching experience and then just general knowledge to help guide future decisions. I like to say that there's 2 different kinds of development blocks that you might run. You might run an exploring block where the intent is more to try something new, or at least try something that's not, well proven. Maybe you only have one block that contains leg press, but it went well. So you might do another block just to see if it starts to become a trend. So those are exploring blocks where your aim is to learn something new about the athlete, but learn something new by trying something that you expect to work. And then the other thing you can do is an exploit block, where you go back through all the blocks that you've done and you more or less play your greatest hits. You find those things that are most correlated with high performance and you run those types of things kind of in a super block. And that's been really effective for us in terms of peaking athletes really well for competitions. Those exploring blocks are a time where you get to really explore the space in terms of individualizing things. Now, it might be that you've tried a number of things and you're looking at it and you go, I think they just need more volume. So you crank the volume up a little bit, or you may watch their video and notice some sort of tendency when the weight gets past a certain load. So you prescribe a special developmental exercise to help correct that deficiency. You can try all those things, but I would say this process just takes seriously the possibility that you might be wrong. That these things that we observe, we hope that they're right, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes you see somebody with a chest fall pattern in the squat. Now, most people respond pretty well to something like a pin squat, but you may have a lifter who just doesn't, and they seem to get better when you do pause squats, which is not typical. But if that's the response type for that specific athlete, they're going to think that's pretty important to know. So kind of monologuing a little bit, so apologize for that, but feel free to direct me wherever you like.
Yeah, no, that's great. And one of the follow-up questions that I do have, because this is a question I get a lot, and so I'm sure a lot of people are really wondering about it, is especially when you are working with kind of a fixed volume load, so to speak, right? How do you know where to start that off, right? Because if you do have more of a progressive volume structure, something like Chad Smith uses, where he starts off kind of on the lower end and then progressively increases it, you can kind of dial things in a little bit easier. So how do you know where to start? And especially, how do you know where to start if someone maybe doesn't necessarily have a long history of training and good record keeping?
Well, if they don't have too much history of training, I would say they're more
Sorry,
like,
I meant more the record.
yeah. Well, I mean, even at that, like I've worked with athletes. It might surprise you how many athletes don't have like a really extensive record of what they did and stuff like that. But I think if you look at just their last program, you can ballpark what the stress of that program is going to be. And we do have some calculations to help us equate stress across different intensity zones. So if you're looking at that, if you're looking at a person's stress index, you can think of it like kind of like number of hard sets, but not all hard sets are created equal, right? Like a 7 RPE set is not the same stress as a 10 RPE set, like that kind of thing. Like on a rough level, that's what stress index is trying to account for. So if you just take their last program, then that can a lot of times provide a good basis to start. And I don't think that volume has to be, or training stress really, has to be dialed in super precisely in order to see any result whatsoever. And I find that a lot of lifters are really training a bit harder than they need to, because we see pretty consistently that even reducing the workload can result in improvements in their strength output, on a reasonably consistent basis, and if it's just for a couple blocks and then that starts to taper off, you're going to know, so as a coach, let's say that you get a new lifter that comes in and they're benching 18, like a stress index of 18. So think of it like 18 hard working sets a week,
Is that across all lifts?
I would calculate it as, anything that's intended to train the bench press. Now, if you go hard in the direction of like isolation movements, then it gets a little funny. The model starts to, um, you just need to use a slightly different model is all. Um, but, assuming that, most powerlifters tend to prefer compound lifts and the isolation stuff isn't a huge component of the program. Let's just say that, their stress index is around 18, 18 working sets a week. I would start them out probably at that level, and if it's a little bit high, then you'll know it pretty soon, and I would tend to bias it down rather than up. I would want to start a lifter off a little bit too low in terms of stress than too high. But if you start them off around an 18, it's probably going to be pretty close to right. Now, let's say that it's a little bit low. Like I said, lots of lifters, even if you back the stress off by a couple points, they'll have a positive response to that. So then you get, 2 development blocks down the road. You've had 2 good development blocks, and then the results start to taper off. At that point, you can look at it and say, hey, they're recovering really well. I kind of think they might need a little bit more volume, a little bit more training stress. Then you can dial that up on the next development block. And it really doesn't cost you very much. I think kind of titrating it in from one development block to the next gives you a lot of control over where the setting is at,
Are there any particular metrics that you would use depending on the athlete and just kind of how they train? So, like, using velocity-based training, or maybe someone really likes, doing speed work, or another person really likes doing just like very frequent, or what I would call frequent, like very high effort sets from one week to the next.
Yeah, I really like to take all that stuff into account. Like from my perspective, nobody has trained that athlete longer than they have. They've been with themselves for every set that they've ever done. So they probably have something important to say about training. And unless I have good reason to discount that perception, I want to go with their perception by default. So if they say it's speed work, or they say it's, benching every day, then all right, we'll try it. But we'll also try other things as well, and we're going to follow the trail of athlete response. So, we may start off, let's take an example of, you mentioned speed work. You got an athlete that's really bought into doing some dynamic effort stuff. So let's say that you start out doing some dynamic effort stuff in your first development block, your first couple development blocks, but then you talk them into getting away from it for just one block, so you can fit in some additional hypertrophy work or something like that. Well, if that goes really well, you may try something else similar, or if it doesn't go well, maybe you go back to what was working. And over time, you start to paint this picture of, hey, when we've had our best responses in the bench press, it's been when we included speed work. You were right. Or when we haven't included speed work, in which case I'd say, hey, I know that you like this speed work thing, but it doesn't seem to be associated with your best training blocks. Now, interestingly enough, I've not had to have too many conversations like that. I think lifters start to develop a sense of, hey, when I'm doing X, my bench is improving, my deadlift is improving, they start to develop a sense of that, which is another reason why I take it seriously. It's not the end of the conversation, but it is important information.
And so how long would you give an exercise, or maybe even a different strategy, before, either validating it, or saying, you know what, I think I've seen enough. I don't necessarily think this is contributing. Like, what kind of timeline are you looking at?
It kind of depends on the movement. Um, if it's something that I've seen work a lot, like let's say pin squats or pause bench, something like that, um, I'll probably try it a bunch, and but if it's still not producing after 4 or 5 training blocks, then I'll probably try something else, let that one go. If it's something that's a little more hit and miss, like slow eccentric deadlifts, you know, some people have responded great to it. Other people have really not gotten anything out of it at all. So if I try it with somebody and after 2 blocks, we haven't managed to get a hit on it, then it's not that I'll never try it again. It's just that I'm going to start being more reluctant to try it. I'm going to need a reason to try it again. Um, so, you know, I think just trying some random things now and then is not terrible. Sometimes, if you only rely on your own, prefrontal cortex, rational explanation of all things in the training process, then you're going to get a fairly limited number of outputs, and there are people who seem to be getting stronger doing training that leaves me scratching my head, that I go, I would have never thought that would work, yet here they are. So in order to kind of leave myself open to that possibility, I like to at least have the option to, just try something because it seems like a good idea. It doesn't always have to follow this process of, we have a tendency in the bench press to mess up the bar path when the weight gets too heavy. Therefore, we need to select from this list of exercises that tend to emphasize bar path placement. Like, that's great, and that gives you a lot of direction. And I would say those are more high probability things to try, and that's great. But sometimes you're pretty far out from competition. Maybe the athlete is a little less focused on, drive up the comp lifts at all costs right now. And they, of course, every athlete wants to get better, but if you're far away from competition and you're thinking, I saw a video of Larry Wheels doing some dumbbell incline and that just looks fun to me, then throw it in there, see what happens. It might be a really good block. Now, why? Maybe it's because of something mechanical. Maybe it's just because the athlete's having a good time in their training. And I think that's a valid reason too. You don't lose pounds off your total because, oh, well, you only did that because it was fun. It wasn't, it wasn't a rational training choice. So we're going to take 20 pounds off your total, so, I mean, if you do something because it's fun and then it makes you stronger, you still got stronger. So, yeah, I suppose I'm making a case for occasionally injecting a little bit of just try it because it seems fun into your training, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I also think there's maybe even a difference in just kind of definition, right? Like when you say random versus what someone else means when they say random, I think a lot of the times can be construed in very different ways.
That's fair, yeah.
Because like I actually had this conversation with a client not too long ago, and essentially I was saying that a lot of their accessory exercises, and I guess I'll kind of like create an objective, like a operational definition. So I'll say like we have our primary lift, which would be like, competition lift, and then maybe a secondary, which is a pretty close derivative. So like deadlift versus a block deadlift or a deficit pull or something like that. And then, you have your accessories that can range from a little bit more specific to very just completely general. So the more specific might be like a belt squat. And then other accessories might just be like a split squat or lat pull down or something like that. And so I was talking to them about accessories, like the very general ones. And I was like, yeah, those don't really contribute a whole lot to your actual performance in to your strength. You know what I mean? Like you bring up your lat pull down, your deadlift isn't really going to go up, you know? And they're like, well, then why are we doing it? And I was like, well, because they asked me, sorry, to kind of backtrack, they were asking me about which should they do? Should they do a pen lay row or should they do this? And I was like, it really doesn't matter. It's not really going to make that much of a difference. You know, you can just kind of pick whatever. We're just doing it to like build muscle and maintain good general fitness and things like that. And they were like, well, why are we doing it? And I kind of realized, like, I was like, oh, they don't understand. When I say it doesn't matter, they don't understand why we're doing it, because our definitions were just kind of different. And so that was just something that kind of came to mind when you were talking
Yeah.
about it as well. But,
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I mean, some things kind of don't matter. You know, like I've noticed in some athletes that like our high probability movements for squatting might be Bulgarian split squats or lunges, reverse lunges. It kind of doesn't matter as long as it's a single leg movement. Or like sometimes I'll see something similar with triceps movements in the bench press. You know, they just need triceps development or single leg movements or whatever the case might be. You know, same with lat movements. Um, Sometimes it does seem to be specific to an exercise, and I can't really explain it, you know. Um, and I think we have to take that seriously, and also take seriously like what the movement might not be doing, not just what it is doing, right? So like if you take, for example, the pen lay row versus say a dumbbell row, you know, they're both rows, they're both more or less training the same musculature. The musculature is not really a prime mover for any of the power lifts, but I tend to see it mostly correlated to success in the deadlift. Um, but one reason why someone might respond better to a dumbbell row might be that the pen lay row presents too much stress on like lower back musculature, or it might be that they don't respond. Or let me rephrase that: they might respond better to the pen lay row because it's an additional stressor on the low back and the glutes in isometric fashion, and that becomes like a positive stimulus. So I mean, it might be what the movement's not doing as much as what it is doing, you know?
yeah, no, that's a good point, because specifically with pen lay rows, I used to do them all the time, but now I do a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of other exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that by the time I get to pen lay rows, my back is just so toast that I can't row anything. Like I do mostly like supported rows or like pull downs or something like that, or maybe like a T-bar
Yeah.
row that's a little better on my back, because
Mm-hmm.
or else I just like I get no lat development and it's just like the craziest low back pump. And then when I'm walking home, I just like it's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me to kind of the next question I had, actually, about the length of the block. So I know you've talked quite a bit about the different types of athletes that you usually encounter that determine the length of a block, but I wanted to know a little bit more about some of those individuals who are doing really well and then kind of stall out for a bit and then have almost like a second win where they see another peak in performance. Because recently, actually, I had my first athlete who kind of followed that trend line, and it was really weird because I'd never experienced anything like that before. It's usually pretty basic. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you train them as long as they perform, and then once they stop, you deload them, and that's their typical length of the cycle. And this is the first time I ever experienced anything like that. And so, how would you even identify that in the first place? Because it seems pretty tricky.
Yeah. Um, I wonder if there's not. I think it can be a case by case thing. Right. Like I talk on occasion about Liz Craven. She was one of the first people I tried this style of training with. One of the things that we noticed with her, she's getting ready for a competition. I forget which one it was. It was a big competition, a lot of pressure for her. And we're getting ready for it. And it's like she's like, what? We were doing a 2x frequency. So I think she was like 2 weeks out from competition, has a bad session, and is kind of in her head about it a little bit. It happens, but she came back and was saying, hey, this was a pretty bad session. How should we adjust the plan based on what just happened? And I was able to go back to the training data, and show her like, this is normal for you. So she always had 2 sessions improving and then 1 session, like 1 bad session. So like 2 up, 1 down, 2 up, 1 down. And that just happened to be a down session. Now you can handle a down session when you're, 8-10 weeks out. It starts to seem a lot more significant when you're 2 weeks out. However, it's still normal, and because I had that training data, I was able to, show it to her and say, look, this is normal for you. This is a normal down session. We've got 2 sessions left. So the next session will be better. And then the last session is the competition. That's going to be at a peak, and sure enough, that's how it went. Now, the reasons why, I think in her case, when you're faced with a pattern that's like that, I think it's got to be fatigue related on some level. It just seems like a fatigue pattern, but you could end up with a more like one-off bad session. I will say that more recently, I've started to think about like mechanisms behind the time to peak issue and stuff like that. I'm not sure that it's adaptation in the physiological sense of adaptation. It might just be athlete boredom, that you're doing the same thing week in, week out. And as long as you're getting stronger, it seems interesting, it seems engaging, fun, But then when you stop getting stronger, a lot of people report that, all of a sudden this repeating everything gets really boring really fast, So if I had a lifter who, I should say that not everybody experiences like that, palpable boredom, it's not like everybody has the same psychological experience around that. But I think there might be something to it, even for the people that are less aware of it. That doesn't mean we should ignore it or we should do something differently about that in particular. But I do think that, if we're talking about mechanisms, that's one potential mechanism and probably a meaningful candidate to explain the time to peak thing. There's a few different factors. You may just have like a one-off bad session that the athlete comes back from. There could be some sort of like recurring recovery issue. Like maybe Monday sessions are just bad sessions in general because, partying over the weekend or something like that. Or like if you're doing a 2x frequency, it could be that, your Thursday session is a bad session because it's only 1 day of rest instead of 2. There's different explanations for stuff like that. But I think in a well-constructed development block, the reason that it finally comes to an end is progress slows and the athlete starts to get bored with that stimulus. So you change up the stimulus, big deal.
And so when you are looking at your deload, like let's say it takes an athlete 5 weeks, and their fifth week is their last week of really productive training, and then on the sixth week is really where you start to see that degradation of performance. When you're actually peaking the athlete for a meet, or actually even just during training, would you go 5 weeks of productive training and then deload? Or would you go 4 weeks of training and then deload, because then technically they're still in their peak on that fifth week? Like, how would you run that, both from a block to block standpoint and then also when you're peaking someone for a competition?
From a block to block standpoint, I would want them to do the highest performance session, highest performance week, and then we can start the deload after that. No need to go past it, but I do think there's some value in actually executing that peak performance session. If you're peaking into a competition, you just want to make sure that you place that peak performance session on the day of competition and then work backwards from there.
And so when you're actually running your deloads, what does that look like for you? Like, how are you actually augmenting? Do you change the exercises? Do you keep things the same? Do you just reduce the volume? Like, how do you actually go about doing that?
The standard approach is to change everything. You would change exercises, the weekly structure, the volume, the stress. You reduce the stress by about half, and the length of the deload, the pivot, is about a third of the length of the development cycle. So if your development cycle was 6 weeks, your pivot's going to be 2 weeks. Something along those lines is a good place to start. Now, what you'll find is that some people will lose too much strength if you do that. So if you go that far away from what they respond well to, you're reducing the workload, you're doing lower intensity, high rep stuff, you're doing less specific exercises. Some people are fine, and then some people lose strength fairly rapidly. So if you're losing too much strength, too much being defined as if you're spending most of your next development cycle kind of regaining lost ground, then it's not really what you want. So if you find that you're losing too much strength during the pivots, you need to do a better job of balancing, the kind of opposing goals of maintaining strength and, reducing fatigue and restoring sensitivity to training. So you may want to reduce intensity and change the exercises and stuff like that, but maybe you don't reduce the intensity quite so much, or maybe you keep the exercises a little more specific, or you keep a little bit more of the volume, or some combination of those things in there so that you can maintain strength a little bit better. But again, it's this trade-off between trying to maintain your strength and trying to reduce the fatigue and restore sensitivity to training. So you're going to lose a little bit. It's not reasonable to try to maintain peak condition all the time. Where do you go from there? So you've got to come down a little bit, but you just don't want to come down so much that you end up spending the whole next development block regaining lost ground.
And so just to clarify, you mentioned decent starting point is a pivot block or a deload that's roughly one third the length of the. Okay, great.
Right.
Awesome. And what kind of process do you use to actually select exercises for your lifters?
For the development blocks or the pivots?
Well, both, I guess, both.
The pivots are a little more loose, I would say. We kind of have some stock ideas of what a pivot might be, and that's usually a good place to start, and you can deviate from there. Things like high bar squats and single leg work, overhead press, and change your stance, change your grip, do some like hardcore bodybuilding stuff for a while, or do something different. Try to get out of the same planes of movement. Try to not train the same pattern of movement over and over and over. Okay. The goal of the pivot is not developing your sport performance. The goal of the pivot is to do everything else that you need to be a functional, healthy human being that you're neglecting during your development cycles, because during your development cycles, you've got this single-minded focus on sport performance. So development cycles tend to be like single-minded focus on sport performance to the exclusion of everything else. And sorry about the phone, but to the exclusion of everything else, and other things get left on the back burner. So a pivot is a great time to put those things in the program. It helps you be durable. It helps you handle the development cycles well. So that's kind of the pivot. And again, from there, you would deviate kind of based on what you see. Pivots are a little bit tough because it's a second level operation. The development cycles are a little more straightforward because you put something in the program and it either makes you better or it doesn't, and you can start to paint that picture over multiple blocks. But for the most part, it's training intervention, and then did it make you stronger or not? It's pretty simple correlation at that point. The pivots are a little more complicated because the training still should make you stronger, but not directly. The pivot, you're not going to be stronger after your pivot, but what you might notice is a well done pivot can help facilitate the next training block. You'll be a little more responsive to the training, or you'll be a little bit healthier, a little more durable, something like that. And so the next development block might go a little bit better. So it's a little bit harder to dial in the pivots. It's no less important, I would say. It's just more difficult. The exercise selection for the development blocks, like I said, is a lot more straightforward. You can start with movement analysis, or what's worked in the past, or just your favorite exercises even, and start to build up this database of what's working in reality. You're going to want to change exercises between development blocks. So for the most part, as much as is reasonable, you try not to run the same exercises for like sequential development blocks. You try to break them up a little bit. But yeah, I've done all of those things. Lifters request an exercise, we'll try to put it in there. I'll do a movement analysis and say, well, they are showing this deficiency or that deficiency, and I find that pause deadlifts or deadlifts with chains or whatever tend to address that. So we give it a try and see if it works for that person. Something else that you'll notice is that there's multiple ways to address a given problem, like a given movement deficiency. The chest fall and squat, you could do pin squats. You could also do safety bar squats or high bar squats or front squats. There's a bunch of different ways you could address it. And then it becomes a matter of which way does the athlete respond best. You may find that most people do great with pin squats, but this one individual doesn't for whatever reason. So safety bar squats work better, so things like that.
How about when you're working with women who might see performance or a decrease in performance depending on where they're at in their monthly cycle? Because I know I've worked with athletes like that. I'm sure you have as well. How do you manage training blocks like that, and how does that impact the actual structure of their mesocycle?
I haven't had the issue with an emerging strategies framework, to be honest. Before I implemented that framework, I would occasionally come across the issue. It tended to not be so much in terms of performance as much as it was in like a few athletes noted that they felt like they were a little bit more injury prone during certain weeks. So we would pre-plan deloads during those weeks. But once we like took those same athletes and once we started running an emerging strategy cycle, it didn't really come up. Now, I mean, full disclosure, it might just be that they didn't bring it up, so yeah, it could be just a limitation in the information that's available to me. Yeah, it would be something to consider for sure.
And
I don't see, sorry, just to kind of
go ahead.
conclude on that idea, I don't see an issue with kind of preempting some training changes. It also might just end up built into the program too, right? So if you've got somebody who has a down performance every fourth week, then that may start to look like a 3-week time to peak, which I suppose it wouldn't. It could for a little while, but it wouldn't if you ever adjusted that timing, right? Because if you adjust your timing for a competition, all of a sudden that sequence is going to be off. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. That's something that hasn't come up with me specifically. So, wish I had a better answer for you.
No, it's all good. I think most of the women that I've coached don't seem to have that problem, but I have had 2 or 3 that like significantly weaker on during a very specific part of their cycle. Like 70% for a triple would be like a grinder kind of week. So yeah, it's pretty rare, but I have seen it happen a couple of times. So I was just wondering if you had any experience with that. But yeah, so I wanted to get your input on how you would go about bringing up maybe a weak lift. So if someone has like a really big squat and a really big deadlift, but their bench is kind of struggling, how would you invest more energy and more time into that lift without, maybe detracting from some of the other lifts?
Well, you're going to need to balance your overall stress. There's only so much stress that an athlete can recover from, and there's only so much stress that a certain set of tissues can handle. So, the squat and the deadlift compete for resources to a significant degree. So if you wanted to apply more training stress to the squat, you may find that you've got to reduce the deadlift workload a little bit. And that's where a stress index can come in fairly handy. So if they're running say a 20 lower body stress, kind of my default would be to split that 10 for squat and 10 for deadlift, but you may find that a lifter doesn't need 10 for the deadlift, they need 7. So you may reallocate that for, it's 13 for the squat and 7 for the deadlift. Or, it is possible that, although they responded to 20, they might respond a little bit better at 17, so 10 for the squat and 7 for the deadlift, and that's another instance where, are they responding? Like say that you're running 10 stress for the deadlift, but then you take out the RDLs that are in the preparatory slot and you sub in dumbbell rows. And all of a sudden you go from a 10 stress for the deadlift to a 7 stress for the deadlift, and they respond better. Are they responding to the dumbbell rows or are they responding to the 7 overall stress? Well, I mean, you can start to paint a picture given enough training blocks, but it may not be super clear in the beginning, but that's okay. You still know that one of those things is resulting in a better overall response. So, you include it in your exploit programs.
Right. And so how many of those exploration programs might you do, let's say, in a given year? or like I would imagine that's kind of dependent on what their competitive cycle looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So in a year like last year, most of my lifters did explore blocks most of the year. Like if man, it was nuts. But um, even then, like you've done a number of exploration blocks. It's starting to feel like um, time to put it all together. Then you may just run an exploit block just for the fun of it. Um, but I've had a handful of athletes who like to compete, and so they'll compete often. And I've had to tell them, like, look, you need to take a break from competing, because all we're doing is, we'll do like two exploit blocks in a comp, two exploit blocks in a comp. And so all we're doing is repeating the same training over and over, which works until it doesn't. So we need some time to explore the space and see if there's anything else out there that's useful. And if it doesn't do anything else, it gives us a break from just hammering that same stimulus over and over. So when we do come back to it, it's at least functional.
I really like that too, because it's almost preemptive in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there have been things where I know like 2 or 3 exercises are going to work really well for my athlete.
Yeah.
I haven't even done it with them yet because there's no need. Everything that I'm doing right now, like, just keeps working. And so it's like, let's just milk it. But yeah, like you were saying, it almost kind of has this like preemptive benefit as well, where it's like, okay, if for some reason, whatever we're doing stops working, then at least we know that we have, these specific exercises, and we have these potential, loading strategies that we can implement, and we saw really good success before. And so it's very likely that we can shorten the amount of downtime between, stagnation and the next
Right.
productive training cycle. So I really like how you frame that, actually. Oh man, I had a question that I wanted to go on, but kind of slipped my mind. Yeah, last year was kind of crazy. I had 3 athletes actually who were going to compete at 2 different competitions, and in both instances, the night before the meet, the meet was canceled.
Night before, wow.
Before, yeah, they got an email at like 5 p.m. and I was just like, "Are you serious?" And in one of them, they didn't cancel it; they rescheduled it for later that month. And I was like, okay, so now all of the athletes are just supposed to maintain their peak for a month. I was like, yeah, I'm out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It reminds me, I went to a competition one time. This was years ago, and our session was supposed to start at 10 in the morning, and the meet director came back and he says, "Yeah, this session's supposed to start at 10, but if you're having a hard time getting warmed up and you need some more time, just let me know and we'll push you back a little bit." And I was like, that's thrown off my entire warm up strategy. Like, I need to be able to count on the start time, so I can time my warm ups appropriately. You can't just have a floating start time. You can't have a floating competition. We'll compete whenever, sometime this month.
Yeah, that happened to one of my athletes at Worlds 2019, I think. We had a start time set, but then they didn't have the board in, like, they didn't have the actual athletes board where it's like, okay, here's the lineup of the lifters, and so we can see their ranking. No one could see, so no one knew. And we'd ask, no, they wouldn't show you. So we're just like, I guess we're just guessing. So we all started warming up, and most of the athletes were warm about 45 minutes prior. Like, they'd done their last set 45 minutes prior. My girl too, same thing. She did her last set like 45 minutes too early because no one had any idea, and it was like, okay, better safe than sorry kind of thing. And I don't think too many people had major issues. Actually, I think everyone kind of did pretty well, but it was a bit of a nightmare working up to it, that's for sure.
I would be an anxious wreck if I was competing in that situation.
Yeah, I know. I was as a coach, and like, I'm like, oh no, you're fine. Don't worry, you're all good. But then in the back of my head, I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible.
This is the worst thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that I actually did want to know about was, determining frequency for the different lifts. And so, I know a lot of big guys have a really successful time with like a 1.5 times frequency. So, like a squat, and then maybe like a deadlift derivative, and then on their deadlift day, a squat derivative, and something like that. And so how do you determine the frequency of a lifter? And also, how would you maybe evaluate whether or not it's time to increase the frequency for a given lifter, even if they have been doing pretty well with whatever they're doing at the moment?
I mean, I think a lot of it's probably similar signals to what you're evaluating as well. Like if there's recovery issues, you may think that well, let's try something a little bit lower frequency. And usually the details matter. That hey, I'm noticing that when I do competition squats, my back is sore for an excessive amount of time, but that's not the case with the SDE movements. Okay, well, maybe we should just try competition squatting a little less frequently, or it's usually problem, and then come up with a specific solution to that problem, and see if it works, and from there follow the trail of athlete response. So I would imagine that it's a similar process to the one that you're using already. What most coaches would do already. It's just that I think there ought to be an additional step of checking it thoroughly to see if we're wrong. That it could be that reducing that frequency helps, but we've been wrong about these things in the past, so it's worth checking. Now, let's say you reduce their frequency for a little while, things are going well. How do you know when it's time to increase it again? Probably the same way that you would know, for anyone else that it's time to increase frequency. Sessions are starting to get a bit too long, or, they're feeling technically rusty between sessions. Just some indication that, hey, we're going a little bit too long. So what happens? Like, how do we combine this into something that's a little bit more frequent? Like, do we have to reduce the stress? Do we have to, manage the type of stress? You'll notice that some people respond better to like low RPE training or high RPE training. Some people get beat up from higher intensities or, higher volumes. It's just different. So paying attention to what that athlete's specific experience is like, and then just, see the problem that the athlete's got and implement a fix for that thing in particular, and then test it to see if it worked. I think that's kind of the main takeaway from most of the emerging strategy stuff.
I really liked a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. I feel like you gave tons of specifics for people who are a little bit more inquisitive about training to really go and kind of put pen to paper and come up with some really interesting training blocks. Do you have any projects on the go? Is there anything that you wanted to kind of shout out real quick?
Oh man, always so much that we're working on, but nothing that's like right now, needs to be talked up, I think. But, I will say that we try to put out as much information on this type of thing as we can. A lot of it's on our YouTube channel, just the Reactive Training Systems YouTube channel. And we also teach a class on this emerging strategies process as well. And it's a real deep dive class. We start out with all the fundamentals and then go as deep as I can take it. We get into specifics. I share a lot of specific strategies that I've implemented with athletes. We, and eventually after we cover as much theory as is necessary. We have case studies that we go over with specific athletes and specific interventions that coaches have made with those athletes and so on. So I'm pretty proud of the classroom that we've put together on all this.
Awesome, man. So I actually did have a question about the classroom. Is that something that is set at a particular time, or is it like a digital course that you can kind of do at your own pace? How does that work?
At the moment, it's there's a particular time. We have classroom openings once a quarter. However, we're in the process of kind of reworking a lot of that so that it's in a more open, more accessible format.
Right.
So yeah, more to follow on that. Always lots of work to be done, but I'm grateful to be able to do it.
That's exciting, man.
Yeah.
Awesome. So where can people find you?
For me personally, probably Instagram's the best place. It's just at Mike Tuchscherer. And then anywhere you can find reactive training systems. YouTube is pretty active. Instagram is active there as well. And then reactivetrainingsystems.com. One thing that you'll find there is if you log in and click on apps, we have a free web app for people to log their training. So if all this stuff sounds interesting to you, there's a whole bunch of web tools in that training log that are designed to help you through this process. So you can log your training, then you can run block reviews on that training, and then meta block reviews on that. And those reviews help analyze your training log data and show you, hey, yeah, it's Bulgarian split squats that you're responding well to, or it's hack squats, or actually it's any single leg movement, or it tries to make those relationships a little bit more plain. So that's something that's available, and we're in development for some coaching tools on that as well. I'm not quite sure when the release date for that will be, but it's getting in the coming soon category at this point. So, keep an eye out for that, for coaches who would like to implement those types of tools with their athletes too. We're working on having some solutions available for people.
That's awesome. Sounds like a really some really exciting projects going on.
Yeah.
So everyone, all that stuff is going to be down in the show notes. Definitely go make sure you check him out. Also, he's got a podcast. I'll link that up in there as well. They're always putting up really, really interesting chats on, this stuff and a whole variety of different things. So make sure you check it out. Make sure you subscribe. Also, make sure you subscribe to my podcast and give me a 5-star review and share it with your friends. And so I can keep putting on awesome content and afford to pay these guys millions of dollars to come on my show. Also, if you guys do have any questions, make sure you hit me up on Instagram. That's where I'm most active. If you have any questions, I'm always answering people's questions. So feel free to hit me up. Just say hi, and we'll chat. Anyways, Mike, thank you so much for jumping on, man. It was an awesome chat. Appreciate you having on.
Good chatting with you.